So this is part two, hopefully two of two and not two of three. We'll see how it goes. There's over 100 slides here, but I think I can get through it quick. I maybe there won't be too many questions, but if you do have a question, that's fine. We'll just try to get through it. As I said, two of two. So a little bit of summary from last time. We talked about how the sanctuaries of ancient Israel, the temple, the tabernacle, but also just kind of the way temples are built in general of various religions. But specifically, of course, the sanctuaries of ancient Israel were constructed according to the pattern of their ancient cosmology, specifically in the manner in which they were built, sort of with successive thresholds indicating the boundaries of heaven and earth, order and chaos, the sacred and the profane, with increasing levels of holiness the further within the sacred space one ventured. So in other words, you start out outside, that represents sort of the chaotic world, and then you enter into the grounds of the temple, the ordered world, into the holy place, which is kind of like Eden, and then into the Holy of Holies, which, depending on how you think of it, is either the Garden of Eden or the place of God himself. And so a temple is a place where heaven and earth converge, where heaven and earth meet. And this, of course, was the pattern of Eden itself, the original God-made temple of the pristine and ideal world before sin, before the fall, where the image of God, Adam, was enshrined in the Holy of Holies. And that's a theme, hopefully, that we'll talk about in our last class, the image of God. The later earthly sanctuaries, the tabernacle, the temple, they were meant to evoke a return into paradise, from whence mankind was banished due to sin. But ultimately, these man-made temples could not undo the fallen condition that we found ourselves in as humanity, as mankind. Human corruption continued to defile even the temple cult itself. And so ultimately, when Christ came, he established the new temple in his own broken body, which is the church, which is the restored Eden, the true place where heaven and earth meet. With the coming of Christ, man no longer worships either in Jerusalem or in Mount Gerizim, but in spirit and in truth. And the book of Revelation describes that eschatological moment where heaven and earth meet when the New Jerusalem, which is the kingdom of heaven, comes down to earth, and there will be no physical temple, for God will fill all things, restoring creation to its true purpose, which is to be the place where God and man dwell together, to be the primordial, original, pristine temple. So that vision of the New Jerusalem coming down is a vision of this union of heaven and earth, which is actually fulfilled in Christ, who is the temple that will not pass away. And so given this eschatological reality, we know that originally there were no separate church buildings. I think most people know that. It's kind of the sort of aphorism that, the church isn't a building, the church is the people. And that's true enough. That's true enough given everything that we've said. It is this eschatological reality of heaven, of the union of heaven and earth. It is Christ's broken body. It is his risen body. It is the new life that we find in Christ. So it's true enough that the church isn't a building. Christians had no temples made by human hands. But at the same time, that's obviously not the full story, because reflection is possible. In the Catholic Church, we believe in the validity of the development of doctrine, that thought can emerge from the seed of a thought and develop into a mighty oak. And so there's this seed of a thought that the true temple is Christ's body, who is the true union of heaven and earth. But over time, as Christians reflected, as the fathers reflected, a complex of symbolism and further reflection and hymnography and ritual and symbolism and iconography developed out of this. And as Christians continue to reflect on the mystery of Christ as the restored temple, and also of the eschatological moments where heaven and earth are fully united, thereby surpassing the need for a temple, perhaps paradoxically, the symbolism of church architecture developed. And while being earthly buildings, paradoxically, these man-made structures, these church temples, point to these same eschatological themes of the primordial temple not made by hands, but also of the ancient earthly temples, which were themselves foreshadowings of the same coming reality of heaven on earth in this immutable point of the event of Christ. When we read some extra biblical materials, I think in one of the Clements, first or second Clement, maybe another one, there's an interesting line where he says, "Brethren, if you do the will of our Father God, you will be of the first church, which was created before the sun and the moon." And I think that is connected to this theme of that the Christians did recognize that beyond any earthly even the gathering itself, the church is the people, but it's not even that. It's this spiritual reality of deification, the spiritual reality and possibility of heaven and earth meeting. That's what the church is. That creation can be intertwined and interpenetrated by its creator, which is what a marriage is, which is what the wedding feast is. So that the church isn't a building; it's the people, but it's not even really the people. It's this it's this possibility of union. But then it's also the people, and then it can be a building too. It builds up and it deconstructs and it reconstructs. So yeah, originally there were no church buildings. Christians met, as we read in the New Testament and in early Christian literature, they met in private homes, and these were the house churches, the domestic churches that we read about. But also the catacombs, where people were buried outside of Roman cities. They were places where funerary meals were traditionally celebrated, both in paganism and in Judaism, and Christians sort of inherited this practice. And when Christians did it, it possibly became the places where agape meals were celebrated on the death anniversaries of their departed loved ones in Christ. And possibly the Eucharist might have been celebrated, where these departed faithful ones were buried. In former times, it was kind of conjectured that perhaps the catacombs served as churches themselves, and Christians met in the catacombs. You might have heard this here and there. It was a very popular thing to say. Scholars today kind of doubt that they were regular meeting places, that like Sunday to Sunday they would meet in the catacombs. But probably on the death anniversaries of important figures from the community, they would gather in the catacombs and celebrate either a ritual meal, like an agape meal, or even possibly celebrate Mass, but just for that day. They weren't regular meeting places. Although the sort of theme of having the remains of our loved ones in Christ around us when we do celebrate the Eucharist did carry over into church architecture and sort of symbolism and thinking. Because you may or may not know, historically altars had to have the relics of martyrs encased within them. And also, while the catacombs themselves didn't serve as churches, as Christianity became legalized in the 4th century and patronized by the Roman Empire, or at the very least tolerated, the tombs of the martyrs did become public shrines called martyria, where Christians would come on pilgrimage and venerate and pray. And eventually, these martyria did become churches after the 4th century. But back to the concept of the house church, right? Because this is kind of where it all began, right? Christians met in each other's homes and people's homes, particularly the homes of wealthy members of the community. So there's a long tradition of rich people founding, outreaches and missions. That's something that has always been going on. And the most famous early house church was the one in the ancient Syrian city of Dariaropos. And you may have seen images of the iconography found in both the church and the synagogue there. And it's an early 3rd century church, and it was interesting for scholars and for people because, especially in Protestant cultures, when people imagine ancient synagogues and ancient churches, they may not have considered the possibility that they would be covered in iconography. But as the archaeological remains show us, actually, I had heard that some of these had been destroyed by like various Islamic groups in the area, so they may not exist anymore. But luckily, most of that stuff had been transported to England by today, in museums and stuff. But the synagogue has sort of preserved most of the iconography of like Moses and Aaron and of biblical scenes and things like that. The church itself, there isn't as much stuff, but certainly a few things, maybe hard to see. Scholars will say that these women depicted over here are possibly the myrrh-bearing women, and the sort of arched area is a baptistry, and in the baptistry there seems to be an image of the Good Shepherd, a human figure holding a sheep, so like Christ holding a lamb kind of thing. And we can see this sort of layout of what it was. And of course, it wasn't built to be a church. It was converted into a church. And so it doesn't really show, it certainly shows some thinking on how to properly use the area, but it doesn't show the kind of cosmological themes of the layers that we will see in later church architecture. But perhaps you can say that there's something there. And if you're trying to abstract some kind of symbolism from it, perhaps there's something one could say about it. But basically, it wasn't originally built as a church. It was converted to a church, so we wouldn't expect to see the fully developed, forms that we have today. Nevertheless, both the church and the synagogue are fascinating examples of early Jewish and Christian religious art. Now, when Christians did start having open church services in public, when Christianity began to be tolerated in the 4th century, and eventually patronized, the first sort of massive buildings that were that Christians began utilizing were the Roman basilicas. And so Christians continued this pattern of converting existing buildings for church use. So first it was homes, and then it were these structures called basilicas. And today, when we hear the word basilica, we think church, right? In Romanian, the word biserica, which comes from basilica, just means church. But originally, it referred to these public Roman government buildings, basically, these halls, which basically were kind of like courthouses or city hall kind of things. And they were usually found nearby the main temple of the city, too, right? So it was like a public building, public in the sense of belonging to the state, to the city, and primarily courthouses or sort of these government buildings where large gatherings could be held. So like a town hall kind of thing, city hall kind of thing, and they were these long rectangular buildings, long halls with a long central nave flanked by aisles on either side, with the roof at 2 levels. In the center, higher over the nave, and lower over the side aisles. And they usually had an apse at one end, containing a raised sort of platform where, during a trial, the tribunal or the Roman judge would be seated, or the magistrates kind of thing, right? And so we see that here, that the apse is that sort of round part, and there would be a raised platform in the apse, and that's where thrones would be set up or chairs would be set up for the judges or the magistrates. And according to some scholars, a curtain may have even separated the tribunal from the nave, sort of creating this feeling of awe and dread for whoever the defendant might be coming to court. And the chief judge or magistrate would be seated on the center throne in what's called a synthronon. So one throne in the center, sort of flanked by other seats around him, right? And we'll see that later. And this was basically wholly adopted into Christian architecture and church architecture. Once again, sort of transfigured using temple themes, but nevertheless originating in this sort of Roman tradition of state buildings. And the reason why Christians began utilizing these buildings were because they were large. They could hold many people. And certainly after the government began patronizing the church as the official religion, you have massive waves of converts. And they need to stand somewhere. They need to fit in the church. House churches aren't going to do it anymore. And so by the end of the 4th century, the basilica form basically became the normative structure, the normative architectural form for Christian churches. And many examples survive today, both East and West, although I would say that like the West does preserve some of the most notable examples of it, like in Italy. Some of these, date to the earliest periods of church history, to late antiquity, 4th, 5th, 6th century kind of thing. And yeah, it does evoke sort of this universe when things were universal in the church. When things, you could go from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western Mediterranean, and everything would basically be the same language. Nothing would be unfamiliar. But eventually, as time went on, people began adapting the basilica style, and new styles of architecture emerged. And specifically, sort of various cruciform shapes began emerging in church architecture. You may have heard of like cross and square, or how medieval church buildings were cross-shaped. Basically, probably this comes from the sort of phenomenon of as the sides of the basilica structure were sort of expanded, allowing the central nave portion to expand out into the aisles, it essentially formed like this intersecting shape where the central hall was intersected by another hall, right, creating this cruciform shape. The intersecting portion of the two hall structures sort of then became an architectural opportunity to have a visual and symbolic focal point. And so they began putting a dome where those two halls would intersect, right? So you kind of see it in the far one. You can sort of imagine if those jutting out portions kind of weren't there, and that's like sort of the ancient basilica shape. And then they let it sort of jut out, and it became cruciform. And then architecturally, where those two halls sort of meet, it's like, oh, we got to make it fancy. We got to make it something special. Put Christ up there in the dome, and it takes on this whole sort of symbolic shape. It gives impetus to a whole symbolic world emerging iconographically and architecturally. And that intersecting hall is usually, especially in Western terms, but you can use it sort of generally too, it's called the transept of the church. And this is a feature that would occur in both Eastern and Western architecture, church architecture. And of course today the dome is so like quintessential to the Byzantine liturgical tradition. When you think of a Byzantine church, either Greek Byzantine or Russian Byzantine, Slavic Byzantine, it's some kind of cupola or dome with Christ in there. That's very, very universal. Although it's found in the West too, like various examples of Western church architecture do feature domes as well. Here's some examples of early Christian temples that we would call Byzantine today. A 6th century Byzantine church from Byzantine Ravenna. Once again, back in the day, it formed one continuous cultural, symbolic world that both Western Catholics and Eastern Catholics inhabited together. And then you have a 12th century church, and you can kind of see how it developed, but you can still see the echoes of the past, very strongly. It's obvious there's a strong family resemblance still. A 12th century church, the Theotokos Kosmosotira. If you know Greek, very interesting church name. Named after Our Lady, the Theotokos Kosmosotira. The Theotokos, she who saves the cosmos. So, all the modern anxiety over titles of Our Blessed Lady, Mediatrix, Co-Redemptrix. Already in the 12th century, the Byzantines were calling her the savioress of the world, literally the savioress of the universe. So tell that to your Protestant friends. Church is named after our Savior, the Theotokos, Our Lady. So also, when your Orthodox friends tell you that Immaculate Conception is not found in the East, we'll just tell them about this church called the Savior of the World, Our Lady of the Theotokos. So, yeah, I mean, if that's, I mean, I would argue it is found, but even if it wasn't found, there's all sorts of exalted titles that you can find in the East, that are just as striking.
I don't know that town. Where is that one?
Fair, I believe somewhere in Greece. Yeah, somewhere in Greece. Yeah. But it is an ancient Byzantine church, 12th century, very, very old.
The Ravenna one has like a vault, but it's not like a proper dome, so it's interesting. You see the architecture develop, and there's more curves in there, so it's kind of the same shape, but a lot more straight lines.
Yeah. You find, you do find churches that look more like the Ravenna church today, kind of in more sort of antique looking, like intentionally sort of archaicizing Byzantine churches. They like to do that sort of thing in Serbia and Bulgaria, but it's also sort of like the sort of straight lines make it look hexagonal or octagonal, and that is actually evocative of the ancient martyria that I mentioned, these martyr shrines, which were circular. Right, so if you think of like the martyr's tomb as being where the shrine began to be erected, and then it builds out from there in a circular fashion. But often it was done in an octagonal way, and some scholars might say that it represents the eighth day of creation, which is the eschatological day. And it makes sense to do that around a martyr, because through their martyrdom they inhabit the eighth day. Like through their willing death, they inhabit the resurrected life already. That was also a shape you found in baptistries. Like when baptistries were separate buildings, it was often octagonal, because once again, through baptism, we die and rise with Christ, and we enter the eighth day of creation, that eternal paschal eschatological moment. But sometimes sometimes it's more roundy and curved, sometimes it's more angular. It just depends. And around this same time, in the early Middle Ages, you have similar things going on in the West, right? You have the emergence of what's called Romanesque architecture and art, which basically it comes from the same moment of this seminal ancient tradition of the basilicas and this very early stratum of Byzantine architecture, and then it develops in the West into this Romanesque architecture and art, which obviously is still very close, right? There's still a strong family resemblance between this 10th to 13th century style of Western art and architecture, iconography and architecture, and what we would call Byzantine, later Byzantine, right? So it's still the same family. At this point the schism has happened, but like you wouldn't necessarily know it from looking around. You wouldn't necessarily know from looking around, because it's still the same symbolic world. It's like if it's like French Canadians and French people in Louisiana or in France. It's still, there's a family resemblance. It's still notably French, but it might sound kind of funny to people's ears if it's a different dialect kind of thing. But there's still a strong family connection there. There's still a common symbolic world that we're inhabiting here, East and West. One interesting thing is, of course, the sort of quintessential church of Eastern Christendom is the Hagia Sophia. And we see sort of the architectural layout in the bottom left corner there. Originally, it actually was a basilica, though. It was rebuilt. So the caption there says, the previous Hagia Sophias were built on the model of a Roman basilica, like the great Constantinian churches in Rome. And eventually, as the caption says, the widespread destruction of the city allowed Justinian to remake the capital according to his own vision, including building a new Hagia Sophia on a completely different plan, right? So you see that earlier angular basilica form, which was once universal in Christianity, and then you see sort of the fully developed Byzantine vision of what a Christian temple looks like. If you're a fan of Star Wars, it looks like the planet Naboo, right? And they and
as soon as he said
yeah.
Star Wars, I was like, it's Naboo. I see.
Yeah, and of course, like the designers, like the artists that worked on it, they did base Naboo on like Byzantine and like Turkish sort of cities.
It's just so
yeah.
interesting. The churches on top of churches is a great tradition in Rome too. I mean, I don't know how many churches deep St. Peter's Basilica is that has so many layers. They just keep building churches on top of it. So
Yeah,
it's cool.
and there's something about that is symbolically. There's something symbolic about it that I can't quite put my finger on. Like especially when you consider the fact that they were once pagan shrines, probably, right? So like I can sort of imagine like our ancient pagan ancestors living there, like even before the classical period, like these cave people basically doing their shamanistic rituals around a fire, and then you have an overlay of like more refined classical paganism, and then you have an overlay of the late antique sort of version of it, and then you have the emergence of Christianity, which conquers the world and conquers those places, and those pagan shrines are replaced by Christian shrines and Christian churches, and then it keeps building, layers within layers, because we're reaching God. Something like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah.
So that's like mid 500s for the new version.
Yeah, Justinian lived in the 6th century, I want to say. Does that sound right?
I think so, like
Yeah.
525.
Yeah, 6th century, right? But it probably wasn't finished for like hundreds of years, Yeah, so like when we think of Byzantine churches today, we think of the Hagia Sophia. Although we also think of these kinds of churches too. To me, like a very beautiful Greek Orthodox parish church would look something like this. I mean, these days, like a lot of churches do want to build Hagia Sophia. Every church that's building their new temple, they always look to the Hagia Sophia. But like Hagia Sophia really only works on the massive scale, which these churches are, right? So these churches do rival the Hagia Sophia, but they're gigantic. They're the size of the Hagia Sophia, right? So the left one is the St. Sava's Cathedral in Serbia, which is modeled after the Hagia Sophia, and then you have the Naval Cathedral, the Russian Naval Cathedral, which is also modeled after the Hagia Sophia. Slightly different takes on it. The Russian one has some neoclassical elements too, but they're basically both based on the sort of architectural plan of the Hagia Sophia with some tweaks. But they're massive, and so they're grandiose when you walk in, right? If you have like a parish church for like 200-300 people, and you build like a mini Hagia Sophia, it almost has the feeling of like a doghouse, It's like for smaller churches, like in my opinion, it would be better to build like actually just a basilica style church, or like something like this if you want a Byzantine looking thing,
Well, there's even like looking at the picture of the Hagia Sophia there, there's so much of this structural support that adds to the mass that they've kind of filled in with, windows and things. And I'm sure that's just structural to keep the whole building up. And so it's interesting on the churches that are modeled after it, they've kind of trimmed it down on the sides because they don't need the structural support. And so it's inspired but different just purely because of the I guess practical considerations and
Sure,
building
yeah.
materials. Because even that old one at Ravenna had, those long things coming out to hold the building up.
Which one?
The
Oh. Yeah.
That one,
Yeah.
These long supports coming out to hold it up. And it looks like in the Hagia Sophia, they've like filled that in to be usable space with windows and everything.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to see a modern example of like a basilica, St. Louis, the chapel, or I don't know if they consider that the chapel, but like the newer part of it is more of the basilica style,
Yeah.
Complete with what you mentioned,
Christ the Judge is where you're talking
Judge
about
would
the
be
judge.
in a room and stuff like that.
Yes. I'll say more about that in a second, actually. Also, the monastery, the Greek Orthodox monastery in Candelia, Texas, is also a basilica style. St. William's is an interesting church because it has kind of quasi-Byzantine elements. There's a big dome. I don't know if we call it Byzantine. It's kind of sort of a Frankenstein style, but a good Frankenstein style. Yeah, but yes. So and then we'll say something a bit about the layout of modern Byzantine churches before we go into sort of the development of these things. Right. This is the image that I made. An image that I made for some catechetical thing. And so some of this terminology might be not exactly what you've heard, and some of that could be just a legitimate variance in practice, or it could be an error too. Like you could have heard the wrong thing too. So I just don't know what you've heard. But basically, both. I'll just say church architecture, not even like Byzantine, but like church layouts, traditional church layouts are tripartite. So a traditional Roman Catholic church building has the exact same layout as a traditional Byzantine church building. It's just kind of, you fudge the numbers a little bit. You squint, it's the same thing, right? But basically, you have the narthex, the nave, and the sanctuary. And yeah, as we kind of said last time or earlier, it's evocative of the structure of the tabernacle and the temple, where you have successive gradations of sanctity as you go in. The further in you go, the further up you go, right? As we said last time, we kind of talked about last time. But yeah, I mean, starting from the back, or yeah, as we enter the church, if we think about that area outside the temple as being sort of this liminal space or a chaotic space between the sacred and the profane, that's what the narthex is. It's a liminal space where we transition from the mundane to the supermundane. And I'll show you some images and more stuff later. Before we step into the nave, which is the main body of the church, and we could say that is where heaven and earth meet. And usually that's where we, if it's a beautiful church with frescoes, we'll see the icons of the saints on the walls. And it truly is like walking into heaven as we see the great cloud of witnesses depicted before our eyes. And then the sanctuary, I mean, and this is a point of difference between Eastern and Western terminology. Generally speaking, in the West, we tend to refer to the whole church as the sanctuary. But generally speaking, in the East, we translate the word bema or bomos in Greek as sanctuary in English, right? And the bema is the area that roughly corresponds to the chancel, so the place behind the iconostas, the place where the clergy enter. Was there a question about that? I saw some perplexed faces. No.
Well, sanctuary usually refers to what would be the nave here, basically. That
Yeah.
sanctuary, so it wouldn't include the narthex.
Okay, fine, good point. I think in all our Protestant churches, just the whole church would be the sanctuary, right? Yeah. But in general sort of imagination, when people say, are you going to the sanctuary, they just kind of mean, are you going to the church, right? But specifically in the Byzantine way and the sort of, I think the other Eastern traditions also follow this custom. And I would wonder if medieval Western sources would say the same thing, if they would if they would refer to just the chancel as the sanctuary. I'm not sure. Yeah, generally speaking, that's the area behind the icon screen or the iconostas. And then sort of, the icons are placed in various ways. The way it's depicted here is not necessarily how you see them everywhere. You have the kleros, which is the chanter stand off to the side. Usually, in some churches, you'll have a choir loft in the back, like a lot of Catholic churches have that, but a lot of Orthodox churches and Byzantine Catholic churches have that too. But sort of the original spot, let's say, is off to the side, because that corresponds to, remember, in the way that it flares out on the sides, the transepts of the church is traditionally where the choirs would be. That's where the monastic stalls would be in monasteries, in both East and West. Like sometimes like in Orthodox monasteries, that's the case, but even when you go to like Benedictine monasteries, in the front, there's those inward-facing stalls or pews where the monks sit, and that corresponds to the kleros of Byzantine churches too, right? And like in a fancy church, you would have one kleros on this side and another kleros on the other side, so that they can chant antiphonally, right, which would match the transepts, right, in monasteries. And generally speaking, the area immediately in front of the icon screen is which has this sort of protruding sort of step that's the same level as the altar itself, which is usually at least 1 or 2 steps higher, is called the ambo, but that wasn't always the case. We'll see how that developed. And the area in front of that is called the solea. Although there's a point of difference here. In the Greek tradition, just that whole floor level space in front of the icon screen is called the solea, so it's floor level. But in the Russian tradition, the solea is actually elevated, and sometimes it forms one structure with the ambo. So it'll be basically like a ledge with a curve, the ambo coming out, and then the rest of the ledge. And the deacon, when he intones the litanies, he'll just stay on that ledge. He won't come down to the floor. Whereas in the Greek tradition, you do come down to the floor. The deacon would come down to the floor to say the litanies and stuff like that. And usually in the Greek tradition, but also you see it in other traditions too, you'll have the bishop's throne to the side near the kleros. And the Ruthenian and Ukrainian traditions have the unique custom of having the tetrapod always in the middle of the church, whereas in other Byzantine traditions, a utility tetrapod or table used for like weddings and stuff, or if there's a pastoral office where you need to use a tetrapod, it would just be off to the side and it would be like sort of wheeled in when you need to use it.
Is that the thing that looks like a table with a cover on it?
No, that's the beer for the plashenitsa. So in the Greek tradition, the epitaphios or plashenitsa is placed in a beer with a covering.
The shroud?
That's the shroud from Holy Friday, right? Whereas in the Russian and Slavic traditions, it's just placed on a table.
Okay.
Yeah. But no, the tetrapod in the Greek tradition looks the same. It's a table.
Okay.
You know, sometimes it's kind of fancier, sometimes it's less fancy. The only difference is it's wheeled in or carried in rather than it always being in the middle. And during festal seasons, there would be an analogion or an icon stand in the middle holding the icon. And in some traditions, that's always there, just like the tetrapod, so it functions equivalently to a tetrapod. Whereas in the Greek tradition, it tends to not be there. It's an analogion is placed there on a feast day. But in a non-festal period, there'd be nothing in the middle of the church. It'd just be open.
Would the tetrapod, even though it's on the side, be empty?
It would have like the stuff that usually is on it, like candles and a cross kind of thing, but it wouldn't be lit. It would just kind of be there. Yeah, it would just.
The thing we think of the tetrapod is like the icon of the feast. That's the narthex in the Greek tradition.
So yeah, here that's where I put it certainly, right? So in there's differences within the Greek tradition too. So yeah, typically, yeah, in a Greek church or an Antiochian church, you go into the narthex, or at least in the back of the nave sometimes. You'll have the patronal icon, so whatever saint or feast the church is dedicated to. It'll have the candle stands to light your votive candles, and then it'll have the festal icon too. Sometimes. But sometimes it'll be in the middle or front of the church, in the middle, on an analogion. And this has to do with the way that the traditions regarding the litia work. Because the litia, I mean, this is going beyond what I was going to talk about. Sometimes it's the front, sometimes it's in the back. That's the long story short, you know. So it's really, it's complex. Maybe we can talk about it later or like afterwards. But yeah, what I was describing before I described that was a situation where it would be in the front in an analogion, just kind of when there's a feast. And then also right in front of the iconostas, there would be an icon of the Theotokos and an icon of Christ that you would venerate. So you wouldn't necessarily venerate the iconostas icons, you would venerate the little icon in front of the iconostas. And then there would be votive stands next to those. And the votive stand would not be in front of the icon, it would be to the side of the icon because you need to venerate the icon. Right? When it's right in front, you know, you're gonna like burn your hair or something or your clothes as you try to kiss the icon, you know. So usually off to the side. And then in like really fancy churches, not only will there be like a small icon of Christ in the Theotokos, but there will be a small icon of everything on the iconostas. So if there's an icon of an angel, there'll be a small icon. So you can venerate every saint that's depicted or holy being depicted there, whether it's Christ or a saint or a lady. And in some traditions, there's this idea that only the bishop or the priest is allowed to venerate the icons of the iconostas because those are the big ones. But you're just the layman. You're just a puny layman, so you venerate the small ones. You know, that's kind of weird. But
they sometimes have like the toddler size analogia right next to it.
yeah,
so-
well, that's more to be cute. But yeah. And then like, well, we're gonna go on forever. But like sometimes you'll see like even a mini version of Christ and the Theotokos on either sides of the royal doors, so that the priest doesn't have to kiss the iconostas icons. He can kiss the mini ones.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
What I was looking at.
Usually Russians will do that. Greeks don't do that. Antiochians don't do that either. But yeah, so if the church is facing east, of course there's the north door and the south door. Generally speaking, processions go from the north door to the south door. So they go counterclockwise. And generally speaking, only priests can pass before the west side of the altar, so in front of the altar. Servers would pass through the east side, around the altar, as you probably already know. And the altar, of course, is there. And in Greek, there's two terms for the altar. Well, one means, one can be translated holy table. Literally, it's the trapeza, which is the dining table. And the other word, thesiasteria or something like that, it means like a religious altar. So there's two. So there's the word that means dining table and the word that means religious altar, and both can be used to describe the altar, right? Sometimes you encounter this thing where it's like Byzantines will say like holy table. It has to be called the holy table, but the word holy table, we have a word in English for holy table, which is altar. So the word altar means a holy table. But this is kind of if we want to really emphasize how we're different from the West, we'll say holy table. But if you want to just play ball, then it's altar. Kind of thing.
Okay, so my understanding, and then this is probably one of those things that you said earlier, is just wrong. But I had been told at some point in my life that
The space is called the altar.
yeah, what you
right?
call the sanctuary is called the altar.
Yeah. So in Greek, the term is bima or bomos. Bima means they both mean like a shrine, basically, right?
Okay.
And so it depends. So how do you imagine a shrine? Do you imagine it like as an object or as a idea? You know what I mean? Like if it's an idea, then it can be a space. If it's a object, you think of it as like the shrine. So like an altar. You imagine like a home shrine, like an altar or a table that has a bunch of stuff on it, right? But it's the phenomenon of synecdoche, right? Where a part stands for a whole, right? When you say, sometimes British people will say, "Oh, where's your toilet?" Right? To us, that sounds a bit crass because like, why are you referring to the toilet itself? But it's a synecdoche where by toilet they mean the whole space with the toilet in it. Maybe that's an improper analogy to use here. That's probably the most improper analogy you could use, actually. I apologize for that. But yeah, so like altar, yeah, but also you can think of it in a synecdoche or I can't remember the difference between a synecdoche and a metony, but whichever one is a part stands for a whole. So the table is the altar, but the space can be the altar. You know what I mean? Just like whatever. The example I used, right?
The way you have it laid out is the same as it is like for the Tridentine Mass.
Yeah, basically it'll be the same way, right?
They call that area the sanctuary that's around the
Oh, they do that. Okay, so there is a equivalent in the West then, right?
Yeah. And pretty much just the priest and deacons. And
Right, the servers. Yeah. And then of course you have the prothesis, which is the altar of oblation or the table of oblation, off to the side where the gifts are prepared, usually to the north of the altar. And then the apse, that whole space where the apse is called the high place. And generally speaking, the high place is a point of veneration. Like during the epistle reading, as the priest goes to the back, he'll venerate the high place. He'll say prayers as he points to the high place. And that sort of points to the idea that even the sanctuary isn't the sanctuary. Even the sanctuary points to the heavenly sanctuary. And you'll usually have, a regal icon of Christ enthroned there, or at least the Theotokos with Christ in her lap or something like that. Or the bishop's throne will be there. And we'll talk about all this in more depth. I fear that we'll have to do part 3 of this now.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's my fault in a certain sense. And then usually have sacristies to the side. But really, it's pointless for me to talk about this because I'm literally going to go into everything in more detail in a second here. The one thing I'll note is that the doors in front of the altar on the ambo, we generally hear the word royal doors said, and that is the most common term. But some scholars will say that's not the most accurate term, that we should call them the beautiful gates. Usually it has the scene of the Annunciation on, so Our Lady on one side and the angel Gabriel on the other, which is very symbolic, right? Because in between, where the altar is, we're about to witness the divine mystery, or we're about to participate in the divine mystery. And the sort of scene of the Annunciation sort of precipitates that. right? It's through humanity's cooperation with God that a great marvel can occur in this world, right? And that moment is, let's say, one of the first moments where Our Lady says yes to God and salvation happens. And then in the altar, man's participation with God in the confecting of the sacrament also makes salvation happen, for the world, right? So it's this symbolic resonance between those two things going on there. But those doors are generally called the royal doors, perhaps more accurately referred to as the beautiful gates. And the reason is the gates in the middle of the gate leading from the narthex into the nave was originally called the royal doors because that's where the emperor walked in through.
Okay.
Yeah. So they were called the royal doors because it was literally the emperor's doors and nobody else walked through those doors.
In the church or in the civic building?
In the church.
Oh, okay. The emperor walked through the central doors.
He walked through these doors. These were the royal doors originally.
Where the people.
Okay.
Side doors.
Okay.
Yeah, side
Okay,
doors.
That clears up a confusion.
Like his retinue would walk through there
That
maybe,
clears up a confusion I had because I had heard that the royal doors historically did not refer to the doors on the iconostas.
That's what I'm telling you.
Okay. Beautiful gates up there is on
The
the
iconostas.
iconostas, right? Okay.
Huh? So what's the confusion?
Are you saying that sometimes we use the phrase royal doors to refer to the gates on the iconostas?
So the most common, yeah, that is what I'm saying. But I'm saying that that's not historically
Okay,
consistent.
okay,
But
I
yeah,
understand.
you just re-articulated my whole point. You just resaid what I said.
I did. I just didn't
Yeah.
understand it when you said it the first time.
Yeah. So the most common term for those gates is the royal doors, right? But some scholars will say that that's not the most accurate term because the term royal doors originally referred to the doors into the church because that's where the emperor walked in through.
Okay.
And they'll say that those doors on the iconostas should be called the beautiful gates.
Or holy doors?
I mean, that's a generic title.
Okay.
But yeah, you can call them the holy doors too. But what door in church isn't a holy door?
I was told
You know,
this class was
yeah,
royal
the-
doors
the-
is elsewhere in the holy
Yeah.
doors.
So the-
Okay.
So my thing though is you just kind of go with what the main thing is. So like you're gonna hear royal doors.
Yeah.
Like you go from east to west, north to south. Everybody's gonna call them the royal doors. So I'm not gonna be the weird guy saying, well, actually they're not called the royal doors, called the beautiful gates. So I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna call them the royal doors too. But for your knowledge, I'm just saying that scholars will say that royal doors refers to the doors into like the original. Like historically, it's the emperor's doors in the center leading into the church. But then it came to be used to describe
Okay.
the doors on the iconostas, the central doors on the iconostas. Although properly they should be called the beautiful gates or the beautiful doors. Yeah, is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and to add another layer, in the West, it's common in the big churches to have like 3 doors between outside the building and inside.
Mhm.
And
That's common.
The middles are never opened except in like a Jubilee year, so no one goes
So it's the
through.
exact same.
Yeah.
It's the exact same. So maybe that originates from the same custom. I mean, to complicate things further, the reason why the doors on the iconostas might be called the royal doors by common convention too is because the emperor walked through those doors as well.
When?
So the emperor was considered a kind of priest ex officio. Because this is what the people always talk about when they talk about Caesaropapism, that whereas in the West there was the Pope, and in the East everybody revered the emperor, in the same way. And this is actually one of the negatives that people will point out about sort of the history of Byzantium and sort of the Orthodox legacy, which is that basically the church was just run by the state, basically, which continued in Russia, and to this day in a way.
The Holy Roman Emperor was also allowed to be seated in the sanctuary though in the West.
That's indeed true. I guess the difference would be that there was the papacy eventually did become a defined thing that served as a safeguard against nationalistic sort of tendencies, whereas in the East, it was all very muddled. The emperor kind of looked like a bishop, kind of dressed like a bishop. Well, really, as we said last time, the bishop kind of dressed kind of like the emperor and kind of not. But from a commoner's perspective, if you're like some peasant living in Constantinople, the emperor is the closest thing to God that you're ever gonna know about, so to speak. And so yeah, he walked through the royal doors, the beautiful gates, also the royal doors, on certain feast days, and he even used the censer. So he would swing the censer like a deacon or a priest, and he would offer the gifts, like the bread and the wine and things like that. Yeah. But enough about that, because we're going to talk more about that, ad nauseum. Although originally there were no Christian temples, as we said, further reflection into the eschatological mystery of the kingdom caused the emergence of the typical interior church layout that we just talked about. And this interior church layout was readily mapped onto the patterns of the ancient sanctuaries of Israel, right? Just as the fathers, we talked about that in our vestment presentation. Just as the fathers were not particularly interested in the historical development of vestments, right? Their origin in secular garments. They weren't particularly interested in the historical secular origin of church architecture either. The idea that it was a basilica and an ancient courthouse kind of thing. They didn't care about that. They just knew that it was like the temple. It was laid out like the temple, and it was a new kind of Christian temple for them. That reflected the same ancient cosmological patterns as the biblical tabernacles and temple, specifically how the temple was heaven and earth. One interesting thing we might point out, though, as we have this side-by-side comparison, is that we can see that everybody sort of moves up one, right? Because in the old temple tabernacle, only the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. Whereas in the Christian temple, priests, deacons, any clergy, minor clergy, server, who's kind of like a minor clergy, all the sacred ministers, they go into the Holy of Holies, right? And in the Israelite temple, only the priest could go into the holy place, and the laity had to stay in the outer court. Whereas in the Christian temple, the laity go into the holy place, the nave, right? And then certainly if you were a Gentile, a dirty Gentile, you couldn't even enter the temple courts. But in the Christian temple, you can enter the narthex, historically. So everybody moves up one, right? Christ draws people closer to him, right? But of course, it's not even that either, because Christ fills all things, right? Some ancient, this is kind of getting on the more woo kind of thing, but I've seen some images of church architecture where it's patterned according to the shape of a man, right? And I think that does have some validity. The head, the feet, they'll say the ancient Israelite temple was shaped like that too, and so there's a sort of cosmic man being depicted in the temple, which makes sense for Christians because that's the new Adam, Christ, right? But Christ fills everything, right? And so he fills the narthex, he fills the nave, and he fills the Holy of Holies, right? He's gone into the Holy of Holies, brought out the blood, and he sprinkles all creation with his own blood, right? That's the whole point of the Yom Kippur ceremony. When the high priest goes in, he sprinkles the blood there, but he brings the holiness out of the Holy of Holies to sanctify the whole world, right? And that's what's happened in Christ in the church. So just because you're in the nave and not in the chancel, that doesn't mean you're not participating fully in that mystery, right? Because even in, as I said, even in the Holy of Holies or the sanctuary, the bima, it's not really the Holy of Holies either, because you look to the high place, which is an icon, which is a wall, which depicts Christ, because that's the real holy. What we always remind, like I said at the beginning, right? There are no Christian temples, but paradoxically we build temples, but they're only valid temples in as much as they point outside of themselves, right? So that's why we have to have the high place to remind us, even this isn't it. Even this isn't it. And that's why the priest has to say, blessed is the kingdom. He has to invoke it. You know what I mean? Because we're not there all the time in our soul, in our hearts, in our mind. He has to invoke it, and then we remind ourselves. It's not even just we're reminding, but sacramentally it happens, right? It's confected in that moment, So yeah. Yes, and the Christian assertion of the sort of fulfillment of earthly temples in the immolated body of our Savior Christ gave these temples, these Christian temples, themes specifically Christocentric, Christological, right? If temples are where heaven meets earth, and if the true temple is Christ's body, right, just as I said, the cosmic man, the cosmic body, then the church building, if it is authentically Christian, is also a reflection specifically of Christ as the meeting point of heaven and earth. And this is just, it's the same image as before, but just with a Western church, just to show you all that it's the same pattern, right? The layout of the church as a temple reflects the same ancient cosmology as temples, with successive increasing levels of sanctity as you venture further in. Going further in is going further up. In the church, we come to the mountain of God. Who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord? He who has pure hands and a clean heart. And the saints encourage us, ascend, brothers, ascend eagerly to the mountain of the Lord. It is the image of the ladder of ascent is the image of, well, it's the image of our own personal spiritual struggle, but it's also an image of the cosmos and of the church, in as much as that progressive movement is the defining dynamic there. Isn't there a C.S. Lewis thing, further up and further in, or something like that? Something about that, yeah. Going further in is like going further up from the outside world into the narthex, into the nave, and into the sanctuary. And even if you can't go into the sanctuary for various reasons, Christ comes out of the sanctuary with fear of God, with faith and love, draw near. That's what the priest says as he comes out of the Holy of Holies with the blood, just like the high priest on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, sprinkling the blood, A funny note, and this is why we're not going to finish. A funny note is in ancient Byzantium, since women were not allowed to go into the holy of the sanctuary, as is the case in many places today. One common way that noble women sort of wanted to sort of indicate that they did have some participation in the Holy of Holies was that they would commission icons of their patron saints to be depicted in the sanctuaries behind the iconostas. So even if they couldn't be in there, their patron saint was in there, even if they couldn't even see that they were in there, right? So they would commission, so that's an interesting thing there, right? A different understandings of participation, right? Another thing about that, though, was like in ancient sort of Greek visual theory, there was this idea that when we looked on objects, we were actually emitting like physical rays out of our eyes, and they bounced back into our eyeball and formed like shapes. And this was like ancient optical theory that was common in the Middle Ages too. And so there was a certain sense in which even if you couldn't go into the holy place, even by looking through the smallest crack, right, you somehow did touch the sacred in there, right? And this is something that existed in both East and West. In the East, obviously, because of the iconostas barrier, but in the West, they had the same thing with the rood screen. And so there's even stories in the Middle Ages how people tried to rush, and like they rushed to the places in the church where you could see like a little sliver, and like these medieval peasants would be trying to claw their way to see, especially when the priest said the words of institution and elevated the gifts. They wanted that moment of seeing through the crack, So yeah, really interesting things. Our experience of worship is completely different than what these ancient people had. It's so weird when you think about it, and our assumptions that we carry, like, we wouldn't say that us sitting here, but like there are certain people that would be offended by such things. Oh, why can't we see the altar? Why are the priests back? Are they better than us? Is there some kind of weird clericalism? Yeah, but yeah, that was nowhere present in the minds of ancient peoples. Not that there isn't some kind of validity to some of those, ideas, but generally speaking, that's very foreign to our way of thinking. Not that there's not some possible validity, but was there some comment?
I'm afraid we won't finish. You just mentioned the root screen.
Yeah. We're not going to finish. I'm sorry. Yeah, go on.
How widespread, if you know, with the root screen, like geographically, was it mostly an English thing, or did it?
So we'll talk about that as we go on. Yeah, if we don't get to that point, then I'll say something at the end. Yeah. So we don't encounter God abstractly in the sanctuary, but specifically as Christ. The altar in the sanctuary not only reflects the Ark of the Covenant, but the tomb of Christ himself. It's not just divine glory, but the glory revealed in the cross, both anagogical and allegorical, both the heavenly, divine, eschatological worship, but it also takes us back to Golgotha. And those two things become united. It's not just God and his glory and his splendor, but specifically it's the slain lamb that we encounter. Allegorical, anagogical. And I emphasize this point, it might be lost on some of y'all, but it's because in the contemporary liturgical sort of theology world, especially in Orthodoxy, there was this movement away from the allegorizing. They say, oh, you shouldn't say that this is like Christ because that's just some medieval weird stuff that people came up with. No, a cigar is just a cigar. You know, the great entrance is just bringing the communion elements to the altar. It's not the road to Golgotha. It's not Christ. It's not symbolism of Christ. It's just this practical thing. And that's what this scholar named Father Alexander Schmemann was sort of known for. Obviously, I'm simplifying a lot, but sort of in American Orthodoxy and Orthodoxy in general, that sort of became it's sort of like the Vatican II of the Orthodox world kind of thing. Whereas traditional Orthodoxy and traditional Catholicism had no problem with this allegorical approach to the Mass or to the Divine Liturgy. That different, and we'll talk about that more in class 4 or class 3, which is really class 6 now or something like that. But so when we are properly oriented in the church, we can behold Christ as the Pantocrator, ruling over all. And also our Immaculate Lady, embodying the church as mother, as Mater Ecclesia, Mother Church, ready to embrace us, her children, in love, ready to nourish us with the divine mysteries. So in this symbolism that's relatively universal in the Byzantine tradition, in the dome you always have Christ, sometimes in large churches with multiple domes. Sometimes you'll see Christ, sometimes you'll see the Trinity, sometimes God the Father as an old man, which is somewhat controversial, but it's not really controversial. But basically the divine, an image of the divine is there. A divine masculine figure of hieratic power and order. And then in the apse, which is the first thing you see, right, when you walk into a church actually, is this feminine, maternal figure. And this is also evoked by even the round shape of the apse, the womb, right? Roundness is feminine. You know, even the shape of the Hagia Sophia is a very feminine shape. If you compare that to like a Gothic cathedral, which is very masculine, right? Spiky. But Byzantine churches are round and maternal and have this feminine aspect, but grounded in this masculine cosmic origin, right? Both are valid, right? Both are valid, right? Because some Byzantine churches are really spiky, so it's not like I'm just waxing poetic here for a second. So yeah, you have the masculine divine figure in the dome, and the Marian image of, usually it's this image called the Platitera, or the Platitera ton oranon, which means she who is wider than the heavens, which depicts Our Lady in oran's posture and prayer posture, and in her body, in her womb, her cosmic womb is depicted in a mandorla, which is like a sort of spiritual bubble. Christ, the infant Christ, reigning in glory with her.
Is the mandorla supposed to evoke all of the, like in the last lecture, you said like when Christ points his finger, there's like a million divine
Yeah.
around.
In fancy depictions with a lot of detail, it would depict like angels in there too, yeah. But it's basically a breaking in of the divine into the world, right? That's what a mandorla is. It's what's in the Transfiguration, the resurrection icon. Anytime there's like a divine hand coming in, there's kind of a mandorla around it, or the dove of the Holy Spirit, there's a mandorla around that. Like you can say it's the divine energies being depicted, you know, from a Byzantine perspective. Yeah, so usually it is that dynamic of Christ, Our Lady, right? And it is significant, I think, that the first thing you see is Our Lady. The first thing you see is the church as mother there. I think that's a significant thing. Because after all, the only way to enter the church is by being born in the waters of baptism, right? So it's only through this maternal act that we can even be incorporated into the church. You cannot have God as your father if you do not have the church for your mother. Yes, and so we read this quote from St. Germanus before, and I'll read the whole one today. It's not that much longer. It's just so this is his commentary on the Divine Liturgy. He's a 6th, 7th century father. He says, "The church is the temple of God, a holy place, a house of prayer, the assembly of the people, the body of Christ. It is called the bride of Christ. It is cleansed by the water of his baptism, sprinkled by his blood, clothed in bridal garments, and sealed with the ointment of the Holy Spirit, according to the prophetic saying, 'Your name is oil poured out, and we run after the fragrance of your myrrh,' which is like precious oil running down upon the beard of Aaron. The church is an earthly heaven in which the super celestial God dwells and walks about. It represents the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It is glorified more than the tabernacle of witness of Moses, in which are the mercy seat and the Holy of Holies. It is prefigured in the patriarchs, foretold by the prophets, founded in the apostles, adorned by the hierarchs, and fulfilled in the martyrs." So not only is it the temple, but specifically it is the temple of Christ, the Christ's own body. And this is what differentiates it from the Old Testament temple and from pagan temples. It is Christ that we encounter. And we read the Kontakion from the Sunday of the Veneration of the Holy Cross. "No longer doth the flaming sword guard the gate of Eden, for a strange extinction hath come upon it, even the tree of the cross. The sting of death has been taken from death, and the victory from Hades. And thou, my Savior, didst appear unto those in Hades, saying, 'Enter ye again into paradise.'" And so as we enter the church, the first thing that we see, the first thing that we encounter is the narthex in the back of the church as we enter in. And like I said, it is this liminal space between heaven and earth, between the mundane and the holy. And in really fancy churches, especially in the Greek tradition, it's like another iconostas, right? So I remember I talked about how it's layers of thresholds, right? The iconostas is only the culmination of a series of sacred thresholds, which delineate the sections of the temple, right? So it is like onions, peeling onions, or it is like those dolls that Rebecca mentioned, right? We can't go deeper. There's no end to the depths of going into God, right? It's this eternal procession, right? So it's layers and layers and layers. And if in a really fancy church, as soon as you go in, you pass these iconostas-looking, narthex doors, and then you find like shrines and shrines, layers of layers, these shrines that are just everywhere, So here, right, you pass to the narthex, you enter the church, and then there's like a second tier of icons here, which is like another iconostas, and then you have these analogian icons, and then you have the iconostas itself, right? So it's just like, it's like how far, like a cynic would say, how far are you trying to keep people from God? But obviously that's not what's going on here, right? God is this mystery that is unending, right? You cannot satisfy, there's no way to grasp it all, and generally speaking, like I said, sometimes you'll find the patron icon and the festal icon back here. And it'll have like the whole series of icons from the iconostas, like in really fancy ones, like John the Baptist, Our Lady, the patron saint, the angels. So it'll just be like a reproduction of the iconostas, basically. And then usually you'll also have the votive candle stands back there, if it's following this tradition. Not always, right? Russian churches tend to have a more reduced narthex. Sometimes it's just like a little hall with nothing in there, So it's it depends. But this is like sort of the Greek tradition that you might encounter. And like I said, here's another narthex, but it's like layers and layers, right? It's really another church, and the Typicon prescribes certain services actually to be done in the narthex.
We're looking at the narthex.
This is the narthex. The iconostas is in there, right? The nave is past here, which has another curtain actually. And then that's the nave, and then this is the iconostas, and those are the royal doors, or the beautiful gates, as we just talked about, right? So it's like God is just the infinitude of God's nature that, you cannot plumb the depths, right? So it's like, the unbaptized have to hang out in the narthex, but the narthex is basically another church, right? It's like basically another chapel. And the Typicon actually prescribes certain prayers, certain services even to be done in the narthex, right? So like in a monastery, sometimes the hours and will be done in the narthex, and like compline and stuff will be done in the narthex. Not all the time, but sometimes, because they're not altar services, right? There's no sacrifice of the mass happening, right? It's only the divine praises being offered, the sacrifice of praise, the divine office being offered, right? And so instead of lighting all the candles in the temple, it's more low key in the narthex, right? And then sometimes, we kind of did this here, but kind of in a way that I'm not so familiar with. We went outside for the Litia prayers. So sometimes on a feast day, like in this sort of Greek monastic way, the icon of the feast will be processed with into the narthex, and it will be placed on the analogion in the narthex, and then those prayers will be done there, and then all the faithful will be in the narthex together. But it's like another chapel, basically, right? And then after those prayers are done, the icon will be processed back into the church, placed on the center analogion, and then the service will proceed with the blessing of the loaves, the articlesia, and the wine. I don't know if you've seen that service, but wine and bread and some oil are blessed. It's almost quasi-Eucharistic, but it's not. My theory is that it's connected to the agape meals of the early church, but because it looks exactly like the Eucharist. You're blessing bread and wine and then consuming it, and it's blessed, but it's not the Eucharist. It's kind of weird in that way, right? Yeah, and in some really fancy churches, there will be multiple narthexes. There will be the iso narthex and the exo narthex. So the inner narthex and the outer narthex. And the exo narthex will typically be like an outdoor narthex, with like an open sort of courtyard kind of thing, right? But it's all about this idea of sanctity and these progressive layers of sanctity, right?
Well, and you were saying earlier, it's not like we're trying to like Christ is present in the whole church.
As is obvious,
these
right?
icons are at every single level. It's not like you have to go
Because God is infinite.
inside to encounter Christ,
Yeah.
encounter Him through the whole journey.
Yeah, and so as we proceed from the narthex, we enter finally the nave of the church, where we encounter heaven on earth, the saints depicted in the icons, the beauty of everything. It's where all the stuff happens, at least for the divine liturgy. As I said, we leave the liminal space and we enter the definite space of God's presence. And there's lots of things in there. And of course, the word nave is evocative of so in Greek it's naos, which is the root for like naval and things like that. So it's evocative of the concept of a ship. And symbolically, we can relate that to like the Ark of the Noah's Ark, the Ark of Salvation, things like that. I think architecturally, it just kind of refers to any kind of vaulted structure, right? And that's the connection. But symbolically, it is connected to the Ark and our Ark of Salvation, right? So this is that Ukrainian church that burned down that I mentioned last time. Beautiful, still beautiful. The new one is beautiful, but they need some more icons. But this is when it was, the full thing, right? And so this is they're doing more of a Russian thing where it is not a tetrapod, but the analogion with the icon. And you notice for this festal resurrection icon, you have flowers all around it, because once again in the church we're in paradise, and then you'll have the votive stands around that sometimes not. Just depends. Yeah, and then in the church, what do we encounter? We encounter shrines, which are called the proskunitaria. So in like a really fancy church, like I said, it's not just the iconostas icons, but there's just like shrines everywhere, like scattered throughout, and as we enter the church, we venerate the icons. So typically you'll come in, you'll venerate the festal icon in the middle, if there is one, and then you'll venerate all the icons on the analogia, and then these shrines are called proskunitaria, which literally means like a veneration place. Proskinesis is veneration or worship, so it's the place where you do proskinesis, the place where you do veneration. So it's basically just like a fancier way to have an icon than just putting it on an analogion. And then of course there's different customs, like folk customs, like these tamata, which are votive like gifts that are left around icons that are considered miraculous icons. Like people will pray for something. Like I see like girls and eyes,
As a leg.
a leg, right? So it's like, or ear, like, so probably people are praying for their children, their daughter or something like that, or to have a baby. There's a baby there, having trouble getting pregnant. There's a heart, maybe something about heart health or even love, you know. So there's all these folk customs around the veneration of icons and the veneration of shrines. But yeah, typically when we enter the church, the first thing we do is we venerate all the icons as much as we can. And one shrine that you might encounter is called the Golgotha, which is obviously referred to that way because it depicts Golgotha, right? It depicts the crucified, our crucified Lord with Our Lady and Saint John flanking him, just like in the Golgotha scene, typically with votive candle stands in front. And this is typically where we pray for our departed loved ones. So we'll light a candle for our departed loved ones in Christ. And then also this is where like the parastas prayers and panikhida prayers will be done in those Byzantine traditions which do this. Because not everyone does, but to me it's a nice custom. It's like a very definite thing. Sometimes you'll have like a mini one, like a mini portable one that has a Golgotha scene with some candle holders, and they'll put that on the tetrapod when they do like a memorial for the dead.
I was just gonna say, the closest we've seen is, and maybe it qualifies as one, is that St. Baptist.
Yeah, I think it's the same guy.
They move theirs around, so they'll put it in the center, I think in Holy Week, but normally. it's
Yeah,
in the
so
center.
it'll double as a Holy Week crucifix scene too. But when it's not being used as that, it's used as a shrine for the dead.
They even
to-
have a candle holder.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's different like pieces that assemble a scene. I mean, it's like the closest thing I've seen to like a manger scene, but it's obviously a completely different moment.
Oh, I'm going to show you some interesting things later, like
Bring it on.
even like yeah, like cut out Jesus icons. Like it's just literally his body cut out of an icon, but just stand alone. Yeah, I don't have that in this presentation, but maybe I'll show you later. And there are statues actually in Russia and stuff that are venerated, you know. So yeah, the Golgotha is one type of shrine that you'll find in church. And sometimes confessions are also heard in front of the Golgotha. So in the middle of the church, in the middle of the nave or the naos, sometimes we'll see a kind of fancy coronal chandelier, a chandelier in the shape of a crown, which is called the horos. And its name derives actually from the space where it hangs above. So the center of the nave is called the horos as well. So the original Byzantine form is that coronal crown-like chandelier. Later, a kind of Baroque style chandelier with many layers was added to the middle, and sometimes you only see that without the horos. And the middle part with the many layers is called the polyaleos, which means the many mercies, because it's usually lit during the singing of the polyaleos, but also it's symbolic of the overflowing mercy of Christ, right? And so here in this one, you have the apostles depicted in the inner part of the horos, with the prophets depicted on the outer part of the horos. And that's because the prophets declared Christ publicly to the world that he would come, while the apostles contemplated the divine mystery of Christ's identity. And then on various feast days and stuff, they'll light the horos, and it's this beautiful ceremony basically where each candle is lit, and then in pitch black, and then they'll start swinging the chandeliers as the choirs chant, and it's this mesmerizing thing, and it sort of is evocative of like this divine dance of Christ with creation, with the church. You can even think of it as the church's wedding crown.
Even the image of the flaming wheel.
It could be angelic too, sure, and also of the New Jerusalem coming down because it hangs so low. It's almost like heaven is protruding into the church in that moment. It's like it's penetrated our reality. This heavenly.
I wonder why and this is helping me see.
Yeah.
Why it is fitting that it moves.
There's even like a small benediction hand here. It's hard, you can't really see it here, but it's like going like that, And this is also where that area is where different liturgical actions happen. right? It's basically equivalent to where the tetrapod would be in the Ruthenian tradition, and where the festal icon would be. So yeah, it's where processions and entrances end up, right? It's the starting point. It's where the bishop might be seated at certain times, although there's a throne to the side, which is a different thing. And it's where the epistle or the Old Testament readings would be read from the middle of the church too. And sometimes the chanters will chant certain things from the center of the church there too. So it's this pivotal sort of point in the church, in the nave of the church.
Would that be in relation to, like, if this was dome style and had Christ?
So it would be right under the dome,
Okay.
Okay.
right? It would be right under the dome. Yeah, and it's called the horos, as I said, and you might wonder, why is it called the horos? It seems the word horos is connected to the word choir, okay? But that's not really where the choir would be today. Although, as I said, sometimes the chanters do come into the middle to chant certain things, and the reader will read intone certain things from there. But generally speaking, it's not where the choir is, but it is connected to the choir from a historical perspective, and I'll explain that more in a second. I just want to point out a few things, which is that, like I said, there is a bishop's throne here, which is like a different thing that I'll explain more. In monastic churches, you have these choir stalls that the lady will stand or sit in, and they have like a bench that comes down, or you can fold it back up. It helps prop you up for the services so that you're not like falling asleep, because they're very long, you know. And the West also had similar ones, right? In like Benedictine monasteries and stuff, the monks would be seated there. And the area behind these shrines, these proscenitaria, where these chairs are, these stalls are where the clergy, visiting clergy, would be seated there. And behind that are the chanters' cleri, the cleroses, and that's where the monastic choirs do their thing. They chant and they read their stuff from there. And typically, this is the patronal icon. There's always an icon of Our Lady there, an icon of a saint they venerate. It might be related to the saint of the day, and then the festal icon. So the arrangement is completely different than just having one in the middle, right? So there's just various traditions of how you arrange those things. But this is a very typical Greek monastic style of arrangement.
How much clearance is there under that thing?
There's still probably a good 4 feet, I would say, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Maybe not, maybe like 2 feet. As I consider it, yeah. Maybe like 2 or 3 feet, I would
Well,
say.
I mean, how high is it off the ground? Like, I feel like I would hit my head on this.
No, you would probably stand like right here.
Oh,
Like, yeah, that's like a regular human size, I think. Like, I mean, so you swing them, right? So when you go like that, you can touch the lowest part of it,
okay.
and then you swing it, right? Yeah. So they're low because they light them by hand, you know, these handles, you know. Yeah, so not where the choir stands today, but the name is evocative of that for historical reasons. But in a certain sense, the whole church is the choir, right? When we're standing in church, we are forming the choir. And so to say that the main part of the nave is also the horos or the choir, it does have symbolic significance in that way, right? But as I said, off to the sides where the transepts, the ends of the transepts. Oh, here's yeah. So here's another. This is Vatopedi, I think. So this is a ritual entrance with the gospel culminating under the horos, right? So it's, yeah, I mean, very beautiful, obviously, you know. Yeah, they have all sorts of interesting things in monasteries, like the silver tree with candles, perhaps evocative of the tree of life kind of thing.
Well, and all the priests have matching vestments.
Yeah. So those are all the hieromonks of the monastery, all the monks of the monastery. Yeah, and they're all, yeah. It might not be Vatopedi, but this is Mount Athos somewhere, I think. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, as I said, like that part in the middle of the church, I called it the horos. Here it just says naos or nave, and then over here it calls the ends of the transept the horos, because historically tonsured chanters, readers, and in monasteries, monks, that's where they would be, as I kind of said, like forming their monastic choirs on those sides, which is the same in Western monastic churches with the choir cells facing inward. You've seen that before. But sometimes the choir was in the center, as we'll see in a second here. And so there was this kind of ambiguity about what the horos is. Basically, the horos originally was just that entire intersecting hall that forms, the transept, right? So there is this kind of ambiguity of what the actual area is, but it's connected to where the choir is. And then I'll show you something in a second that kind of elucidates why that's ambiguous. But today, generally speaking, the choir areas are on the sides, and it's not referred to as the horos, but as the kleros, which actually means the place of the clergy. But that kind of makes sense too, because that's where the clergy would be in choir in a certain sense, or the monastics are kind of like clergy too, and the chanter stands are over there, and this is a bishop's throne. This is a different church, but bishop's throne is right there. And
Bishop's throne.
so I'll talk about this is the next thing. Maybe I'll answer your question. If not, just answer. Right. So right next to the choir, this is a different church, but right next to the choir, you see the kleros stand right to the edge. There is the bishop's throne, one of his thrones. Right. He has multiple thrones. It's really his choir stall. Right. It's where he sits when he is in choir rather than serving. This is why it's near the kleros, because it's like an extension of the kleros. But where it's an important one where the bishop sits, and then in monasteries you'll have other ones too that are fancy for the abbot and for like important priests like the archimandrite and things like that, right? But in parish churches and in monasteries, it's for the bishop, right? If there's multiple ones, then other high-ranking clergy can sit there too. But basically, if there's only one, that's the bishop's one. And historically, the emperor and his spouse had similar sets of seats near that same area, right? And here's yours truly serving at a hierarchical liturgy where the bishop is on that throne. And notice the kleros to the side. It's like an extension of the kleros, but his is obviously more important, right? I blanked out the face because that's not a good man. He's no longer a bishop also. But I'll just leave that there.
So, but you're holding up so he can chant along because he's in his choir?
It's like his prayers that he's supposed to say for that liturgical moment.
So even when he's not serving, he has...
Yeah, notice that all the priests and deacons have gathered around him.
Yeah.
Because, even when he's in choir, like there's certain prayers that he has to say,
Okay.
and he says them in choir, like sort of at leisure he says them in a weird way. Because not every service calls for the bishop to serve. You know what I mean? Like, so he's only going to be in choir anyways, but there's still prayers that he has to say, As I said, there's other places a bishop might sit in particular contexts, such as the center of the naos or the nave, like here. And when he does that, his seat is called the cathedra. And sometimes this is called the cathedra as well, but especially when it's the center one, and certainly when there's like a sort of stand that he's on. He's not on a stand, he's just in a chair, but sometimes the throne will be on like a special stand. And that is especially called the cathedra. So like here, that square stand on the left, that would be called the cathedra, right?
Just noticing the vestments here because it's the non... Sticaria?
The sakos, he's wearing a
Yeah,
sakos.
the sakos.
Yeah.
Mhm. But he's wearing it over, so you still have the white garment underneath, and you still have...
Yes. Oh, the sticarian is under.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. He has so when he sits in the middle of the church, this is actually evocative of, once again, the importance of that central area of the choros, the naos, but also of the historical reality that there was a structure that used to be there that's no longer there. That's super important, right? And this is a crazy thing because it was a very important thing which no longer exists really, except for in a few places. And this is, and remember, I said that today the ambo is that round part that juts out of the altar, right? And in that other depiction, which is the same church, it has the ambo and then the cathedra. But the thing, and it has the festal icon in front of that. But and the cathedra is roughly where the tetrapod would be in the Ruthenian tradition, as I said, or where the festal icon would be. They moved it forward here. But actually, the original ambo was in the center of the church. Okay, so the churches originally used to look like this, where there wasn't really an iconostas, but there was sort of this sanctuary barrier with columns surrounding the altar in a square shape. And in the middle of the church, there was this platform, a raised platform. Should I turn the lights on? Are people like dozing off? Like, is that, or, okay, that's fine, yeah. Here's a better resolution one that's a bit more detailed. So there still would be curtains around, right, forming a barrier. So it wasn't like open. Sometimes people will say, oh, we need to get rid of the iconostas, because in the early church, there was no iconostas. But there was this kind of sanctuary barrier with curtains, right? So let's, hold our horses here. And then the original ambo was this raised platform. So very different than any church that you've seen today. That does not exist, right? And it's basically where the tetrapod would be. It's where the festal icon would be, and where those bishops were seated when they were in the middle. And it's where the horos of the church is, too, right?
So when people ascend that in order to venerate the icons?
Yeah,
That's a place you shouldn't go.
And remember, I also said that, okay, so like, what it was it was a platform for the chanters to chant from, number one. So during important hymns, they would go up onto the ambo and chant, and at other times they would be on the bottom tier of the ambo and chanting from there, right? Because remember I said, what's the deal with it being called the horos? The choir's not there, but they used to be in the middle of the church, under the ambo or on top of the ambo, or in the ambo, rather. It's also where the deacon would come out and read the gospel, and where the subdeacon would read the epistle from, or the reader would read the epistle from. And they would read it from one or the other side of the ambo, either on this round part or that round part, with the book leaning against either side. And maybe there was like some kind of book stand there, right? And this is where the custom comes from, because this was universal actually, both East and West. And I'll show you some Western examples in a second too. This is where the custom comes from in the Latin Mass, where the gospel is read facing the north, and the epistle is read, I guess, from facing the south, right? Because it comes from the idea of you're leaning the book against either the north or the south side of the ambo, and so if you're the laity, you're like over here or over here. So sometimes you would be on the side where you could face the gospel, and sometimes you're on the epistle side, and it's also where the deacon would intone the litanies from, and where the sermons may have been given, although that's a bit ambiguous. And it's also sometimes where the bishop would be seated in certain moments, not all the time, but in certain moments. So the bishop might come out there, a throne would be placed there, and he would sit there and give the sermon or something like that. It's also where the exaltation of the Holy Cross would happen. So they would take the relic of the cross, and I'll show you some depictions of that in a second, right? So it's very, very different. Yeah, although today it refers to that area right in front of the royal doors, right? That round part. In the ancient church, both east and west, it would have been this structure, this platform in the middle of the church, where the bishop's cathedra or where the tetrapod would be today, or the festal icon today. So this is the ambo, what it looked like in the Hagia Sophia. And note how, once again, the iconostas isn't really an iconostas yet. It's just an icon. It's like a chancel screen. And notice where the doors are, right? It's not in front, but it's to the side. So it's actually kind of like, if they ever build a altar rail here, it's going to be like that, right? And it's basically an altar rail with beams, right? That's what this is, and curtains, right? And I also said that the solea is the walking area in front of the altar. So the original solea was this railed off walkway from the altar into the ambo, right? So solea is a walkway, but back then it was specifically the walkway from the altar to here, whereas now it's just the general walkway in front of the altar.
Where would you receive communion at? Would they come around on the other side of?
So scholars don't really know, but it's possible that it would have been here, or it could have been,
Interesting.
you know, over the basically like an altar railing over the altar rail, you know. But basically we don't know how it would have been. Yes, so yeah, as I said, it's where the chanters also hung out, which is why today the Horos area is called that, you know. That's where that, so is that explained now, kind of, why it's called the, yeah, okay. Yes, okay, so we probably have to stop soon, huh? It's 8:12 now, so, yeah. So, here's an extant ambo in an Orthodox church, the Church of the Dormition in Kalabaka. Very weird, right? Because it's like, it's also a small church. Imagine stepping into like this small little church, and then there's just this massive structure sort of like taking up all this space. But yeah, back in the day, most churches had these. Yeah, I mean, I doubt they use it today in the original way, but it's there. I see that they put an analogian in front there so people don't try to walk up it, probably.
It's like the old pulpits, but the pulpits were usually on a.
Yes, so it did develop into those, yeah, in both East and West, actually.
I mean, I don't know how historical this painting is, but there's that painting of John Chrysostom addressing the empress, and I always wondered what he was on.
An ambo.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
And actually, if you go to a Jewish synagogue, they also have ambos.
Okay.
And they refer to the ambo actually as a bima,
Huh.
which is what we call the sanctuary in Greek. Right? So it's connected somehow historically. So here's some examples of Western ambos. So this is the ambo at Santa Maria in Cosmodine in Italy. And notice that they even have the same thing as the Hagia Sophia, this altar screen, right? And this is a Latin Catholic church, right? And here's another picture of the same place. And notice that there's two ambos, right? So there probably was a gospel ambo and an epistle ambo. And this area in the middle was probably where the Schola Cantorum was, the chanter. So it's the exact same thing as the Hagia Sophia, except that there's two ambos, right? And so they have a horos in the middle of the church, which is the choir, which is the Schola Cantorum, right? Today they just use it as seating. And today it has been converted into a Melkite Catholic church.
Okay, I was wondering where.
But it was a Latin Catholic church, right? But it has all the elements of an ancient Byzantine church, right? Once again, same. It was the same tradition. We have one tradition, right, between the two Romes. The ambo at the Duomo of Ravello. And once again, this seems to be off to the side too, not in the middle, but still like in the middle generally. And yeah, it's a place with two of them too. And so the schola, the chanters would be in the middle, the choir would be in the middle. Same thing. And notice that in all these, the altar has the ciborium over it, which is the same thing as a baldacchino kind of thing. The canopy, and we'll talk about that, I guess, in the next class. But and of course the Hagia Sophia had that too, and that's a significant thing, a baldacchino or a ciborium. So ciborium today refers to like a thing that has Holy Communion in it, but it refers to a covering, right? So the altar's canopy is referred to as a ciborium or chiborium. In Greek, kivorion. So it's a Greek term actually. So this is, I think this is San Clemente, where a deacon is reading the gospel, I guess, from there. So it's still used today, here and there. And this is what St. Germanus says. He says, the ambo manifests the shape of the stone at the Holy Sepulchre, proclaiming the resurrection of the Lord to the myrrh-bearing women. This is according to the words of the prophet, climb, O herald of good tidings, lift up your voice with strength, Isaiah 49. For the ambo is a mountain situated in a flat and level place. So once again, this idea of the mountain of the Lord. And it's a reconstructed ambo at the Belgrade Theological Academy chapel, the chapel of St. John at their seminary, where they've constructed one, they put it in their chapel, and they're doing like reconstructed liturgies, sort of liturgical archaeology kind of things. So kind of interesting. it's a bit weird, but interesting too. Here's a depiction of the exaltation of the cross, where the bishop mounts the ambo to bless the congregation with the cross. And here's a Western depiction of an ambo, the deacon reading the Paschal Preconium, which is the exalted hymn. Rejoice, heavenly powers, sing choirs of angels, on Easter night at the Easter Vigil. So that's what he's chanting. That's what's in the scroll. But yeah, interesting that it was a universal thing. And here's the icon of the exaltation of the cross, where the bishop is standing in an ambo, exalting or elevating the cross at the exaltation
I
feast.
would have thought that was like a bishop's chair or something, so.
Yeah, once again, there probably was a throne in there too.
Oh, right.
yeah.
Okay, yep.
And you know who these guys are with the sombreros?
No.
They're chanters. So chanters used to wear these hats, these little sombrero-looking hats, back in Byzantine times. No longer worn today.
Can we bring it back? We can get Mark one.
So there's a Byzantine choir called the Romeco Ensemble, where they have tried to revive it. So they wear like reconstructed Byzantine clothing and hats and stuff. Yeah. And actually, one interesting thing is, and maybe we'll close after this, is that because of the prominence of the ambo in the middle of the church, there used to be this ceremony done on certain feast days in Matins and Orthros called the Dance of the Three Holy Youths, where three servers depicting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would proceed ceremonially into the ambo, up the ambo, while chanting the hymn of the Three Holy Youths, and they would even do a little dance. They would lift their hands in like in prayer, in orans, kind of, to God, like as they circumambulated one way and then they would go the other. I don't know all the details, but there was a little dance that they would do. So liturgical dance is very ancient, actually. While a cutout icon of the Archangel Michael was lowered into the ambo, depicting the angel, well, it was Christ, but here they use Michael, coming down to comfort the children, in the blazing fire, right? So this was a very popular ceremony done in both Byzantium and Rus. Obviously, this is not done today anywhere, right? But interesting.
So folky.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, back in the day, it would have been more than folky. It would have been like this imperial ceremony, Like, I think this is like a emperor or a czar, like sort of presiding over this ceremony. So, like, very.
Folky is in like, this is the stuff that's
Oh.
really meaningful to like the common folk.
Yes.
You see this and you're like,
Yeah.
it's happening.
This is also the stuff that people would find bizarre, right? Like, people think of ancient liturgy as being like, I don't know, like very austere, and it certainly was in certain ways. But like, yeah, the idea that there's this weird little liturgical dance that they did in the ambo, and they lowered, like, this very theatrical activity of lowering this cutout icon of Saint Michael, and very, very, yeah, you would never see it today, and people would think that you're lying if you said that this was real. Like, I'm surprised that this, I mean, and the fact that this artistic depiction exists shows that it was well known enough. Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. We no longer have that. It's just been replaced by the little space in front of the altar. Although, like I think in Romania and Serbia, sometimes the ambo will be like disconnected from the altar, and it'll be just this round platform, like the cathedral that I was showing you before, but round, which does sort of evoke the idea that it was a platform before. And then, of course, in the Ruthenian, Ukrainian tradition, that space has become the space of the tetrapod. And I kind of wonder,
There's a little pulpit off the side there too.
yeah, so this is the cathedral in Lvov, Lviv or Lvov. And it's interesting because it looks very Western in a certain sense, very Baroque and Western. And you can't even really tell that there is an iconostas, which is very minimalistic. I mean, not minimalistic in the sense that it's very Baroque, but like as far as like, it doesn't look like a traditional iconostas. It just looks like an extension of these columns. So Christ, Theotokos, royal doors, or beautiful gates, and that's all. And there's an altar back there. And then there's some shrines out here, some side shrines. But kind of this, I guess this is what the Latinization was, It's still very beautiful, you know. It looks like, it reminds me of like Bernini kind of thing. Still very beautiful, not very Byzantine looking. But you know, whatever. You know, it's
Yeah,
just,
well, I mean, just trying to see, is it still the Theotokos?
yeah, it's still the traditional arrangement,
Yeah.
or
They're very Western
yeah,
art.
very, yeah.
Well, I mean, like behind the altar there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Terra-
Above.
Terra.
Is that
Oh,
the
oh.
Terra up at the top there? But obviously in a Western style?
It might be like the Assumption.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I don't. How about this or this?
I'm talking about the upper one.
I would guess it's the Assumption, just because there's, but it could be plenty. It could just be the Virgin enthroned too.
Okay.
And just like generically, you know.
And what's the other one?
This.
Yeah.
This is a cathedral in Serbia or Romania. I can't remember which one. But I was just showing you that even though there's no ancient ambo anymore, there's still some places like a platform kind of thing. But yeah, so that same space, that same object is no longer gone, even though it was so important in the ancient liturgical ceremonies. And now there's just either an open space or the tetrapod or the icon or the bishop's cathedra or something like that. Interesting. So because it is so late, man, I really have a bad way of anticipating how these are going to go. We'll stop now. Right before we move into this is actually a good place to stop because we are treading lightly before we step into the Holy of Holies, the Bema, the Bomos.